Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Hacienda La Papaya, wash processed Ecuador from Mood Trap Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Mood Trap, based out of Singapore, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, with our most recent review being about 2 months ago. It should come as no surprise to anyone that I was extremely interested in this coffee, given that the only other time we had ever reviewed any of Mood Trap's wash processed Mejorado coffees, it would end up being one of my favorite coffees that we had ever reviewed on this channel. So even though there has been a lot of mixed reaction to Mood Trap recently, I still had some very high hopes and expectations for this coffee, and it'll be interesting to see how it turned out, as this right here is day 66. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which does indicate a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This one is most in line with the most recent experience that we have had from Mood Trap, which some people have described as being on the more roasty or developed side of things. And while I can say that it did feel significantly more developed than the earlier experiences we have had from this coffee roaster, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say that it was particularly roasty, but in comparison, the other notable Singaporean-based coffee roaster right now, which is of course Exposure Therapy, is significantly lighter than the experience that we did have with this coffee. As mentioned, this one is pretty close to being on par with that most recent experience for Mood Trap, which we described as being on the more medium light side of things, with maybe a little bit more development to it at that as well. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 40, first impression. So we did give it the 40-day rest period that is suggested by Mood Trap based off of some of their earlier coffees, and the coffee was significantly more plain than expected, as it felt like perhaps the coffee was a little bit early, as it offered a generic citric feel without much depth behind it. Honestly, there wasn't too much worth noting, as it had one of the most underwhelming first impressions that we had ever had from a Mood Trap coffee, and it's probably the least amount of notes I've taken for a first impression of a coffee in a very long time, as I really didn't pick too much out from that experience. Day 43 through the Chemex, and it was significantly better, as it feels like this coffee has possibly not reached its potential yet. And what I was honestly hoping for based off of these first two experiences was that this coffee would drastically improve with a little bit more rest and time. It continued to feel relatively tame, as there was only a moderate level of sweetness, with the profile being reminiscent of the most recent Mood Trap coffee that we had had. In addition to that, a more prominent peach, but it is still relatively tame in comparison to, we'll just say, Mejorados in general. But even your average coffee, I had to say that this one felt significantly more toned down than what I was expecting. Day 46 to the UFO brewer, and there were still plenty of struggles with this coffee, as it's coming out a bit generic, especially for a Mejorado coffee. So I'm going to go back to that, as usually when it comes to Mejorado coffees, I'm definitely looking for a lot of sweetness and at least a fair bit of intensity in one specific direction. But this one continued to lack that, as there was more of that focus on the citric attributes in a generic sense, with a slightly robust feel all around. So I'm still not going to go as far as to say that it was particularly roasty. I can imagine some people feeling or experiencing that from this coffee, but I wouldn't go that far. It just felt robust, a little heavier overall. Day 50 through the V60 with Mood Trap's ratio. So Mood Trap just has a ratio which is a 16.67 to 1, and we decided to go both directions with this coffee, which included pushing it on this day, and we opted for the higher temperatures at 99 degrees Celsius. And the struggles continued, as this was the most uneven presentation of this coffee up to this point, as there was a very prominent bitterness that I would describe as being in line with licorice, to the extent that it provided a very dark bitterness to this one in general, and more of those robust characteristics once again. So this was my least favorite day of this coffee, and it felt like adjustments were definitely needed. Day 53 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the coffee was a little better today, and I started to notice this theme that the coffee was just better with the Chemex. For whatever reason, I think it was kind of stripping away some maybe less desirable qualities. It did have a little bit more of the peachiness in comparison to some of the earlier days, but a little better definition overall. It still didn't cool off particularly well, as this one had a slight savory cracker-like feel, which would be a little prominent from this point going forward, as on day 56 we opted for the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so we went the opposite direction, 15 to 1 at 93 degrees Celsius, and the coffee is significantly less impressive today as it is offering more of that strange, savory cracker quality to it with a more generic feel once again. Lacking any sort of notable sweetness or even a defining characteristic as it continues to remain just a little bit more robust in general. On day 59 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it was a little better, which continues to be the theme. We got better results for the Chemex with whichever recipe we went with for this coffee, and it's offering a bit more generic of a sugary quality, which is a win for me given that I was really hoping for that quality to be much more abundant, but at least now we're starting to experience a little bit more of that. Closer to the day 43 mark, as it felt like the coffee really didn't improve much with time, continuing to offer faint generic qualities to it with an overall tame experience once again. So I mentioned on the day 43 mark, I was really hoping to see this coffee just kind of open up with time, but it really never seemed to, as it was just consistent based off some of the earlier impressions we had. Day 62 final notes we have through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the coffee is better as there's more depth. So in that sense, I can say that if it is still opening up, it's an extremely slow process as it's just reminiscent of the earlier mark that we did have. Can essentially say that there's a more malic, citric, green apple, lemon mix with a refined, sugary, mejorado quality to it, all present in a more subtle sense. A slight honey and honeysuckle characteristic with a grape berry feel, some slight apricots, but a very interesting and unusual roasted tea feel to go along with that slight savory quality that has also remained present from that point going forward. All right. Let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And the tasting wheel itself doesn't look that bad. I feel like I might have been a little bit generous on this tasting wheel, but let's kind of go through it one by one. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. It is not quite as clean as a number of other Hacienda La Papaya Mejorado coffees that I've had in the past. It's cleaner than at least the one that we had from Acid, which was pretty roasty, significantly more roasty than even this coffee was. So level 4, where we opted to put that, even if it's faint, even if it's generic, it's kind of hard to take too much away from this coffee, given that the only undesirable quality was that interesting, unusual, savory feel to it, and at times that bitterness. Like, if we're scoring this coffee based off of the day we pushed it through the V60, yeah, I'm probably bumping it down to the level 3, but it reaches the bare minimum for a level 4 on this coffee. Not particularly the cleanest, but not enough to really take away from it. Finish level 4. It does have a pretty distinct finish to it between the savory quality and that prominent roasted tea characteristic towards the end. It's pretty distinct and it's lasting, so level 4 where we opted to put that. Sweetness level 4. That's maybe one of the more generous sweetness scores that we've had in a very long time, as towards the end, I'm seeing a little bit more of the sugary intent behind this coffee, a little bit more of that honeysuckle characteristic, but the vast majority of the time we were brewing this coffee, it was somewhere between the 3 and even lower than the 3. I feel like it wouldn't be too harsh to put it at a level 2 based off some of the earlier days that we did have, but towards the end, just a little bit more sweetness. Working with this coffee seems to help, so level 4 where we opted to put that. Florality level 4, already mentioned honeysuckle-like characteristic, which is classic for what you'd expect for the Mejorado coffee, something we get a lot, and also probably a little generous, but it did seem to expand upon with a little bit more time. Citrus fruit level 4, it was consistent, even if it was generic and maybe lacking a lot of the time, but I can say that whatever that generic citric quality was, a little bit more of a softer lemon, and I can also see some of those apple-like qualities to it, which is pretty synonymous with Mejorado coffees as well. Both of those would lump into that level 4 category. Let's go ahead and move on to the level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. Not the brightest coffee whatsoever, and Mejorado coffees in general do fluctuate between the 3 and the 4. I feel like I say that every single time, but this one, even then, it didn't have even a lot of potential to reach above that level 3 mark. It was so generic on the earlier days that I could even see the acidity being lower than that too. So level 3 where we opted to put that. Berry fruit level 3, I mentioned some of those slight berry qualities to it. A little bit more of a darker berry, so that grape feel characteristic. Stone fruit level 3, those apricot qualities. I think this is where intensity would be really important within a tasting wheel, because if there was an intensity chart, a place to chart intensity of this coffee, you'd kind of see that even though these qualities are scoring 4s and 3s, they're on the lower side and they're not necessarily the most intense or pronounced. Caramel level 3, also probably a little generous. I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I'm like, these are all probably a little generous. It does have a little bit of that sugary quality to it. I wouldn't necessarily say it's particularly distinct. It is very much in line with that honeysuckle characteristic. So level 3 where we opted to put that. Final thing worth discussing, the body at the level 2 lighter bodied cup of coffee. A combination of factors would definitely justify that. The Chemex, of course, being one of them, a wash processed coffee. But yeah, that's kind of the only thing left worth discussing in this tasting wheel. As I'm looking at it, I definitely think it's a generous looking tasting wheel, but it's a somewhat accurate representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've heard a lot of negative things about this coffee as well, and I've heard, I want to say, 1 or 2 positive things about this coffee, but the vast majority of feedback I've had on it has been pretty mixed. But I feel like in the same way, I wasn't as harsh and critical of the Arbogona as a lot of other people were. I didn't think this coffee was quite as bad as some of the other feedback I've heard about it. I think it's fine in the same way that the Arbogona was fine. I feel like it certainly didn't reach the expectations that I did have for this coffee. I mean, the only other Mejorado coffee we reviewed was my favorite coffee of the year that we did review it. So Moontrap has definitely set the expectations extremely high for themselves. And I feel like right now they're kind of the victim of their own expectations. As if I was served this coffee by a different coffee roaster, I would feel the same way. I would feel that it was a little bit underwhelming. I mean, Hacienda La Papaya, these Mejorado coffees are some of my favorite coffees. I mean, I really enjoyed the sample that I got from H&S this year, and this one was not quite what I was expecting whatsoever. It didn't have the sweetness I was looking for. It didn't have the intensity I was looking for. It didn't have a defining characteristic that I was really hoping it would have. So this one for me was just fine. I guess I can say I wasn't anywhere near what I was expecting. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's tricky, so I think that it's a coffee that is a challenge, probably something that will take a lot of effort. It has a lot of those citric qualities, even if they are presented in a slightly more generic sense. It does have some slight Mejorado characteristics. It's still relatively clean for what the coffee is. Yeah, I mean, not the brightest. Those are kind of the characteristics I can think of to suggest for a coffee like this. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Hacienda La Papaya, wash processed Ecuador from Moontrap Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.